Yeah. So in order to have this positive, productive interface between translation and comparative, or translation and literary studies in general, right? If you want to have a positive thing, then he says that while doing research in translation, which involves translation, a researcher should make these three clear-cut distinctions, right? And which are those distinctions? The first distinction he proposes is between translating and translation. So if you are studying translation as a student or a researcher, you should be clear, आप क्या पढ़ रहे हो? Translation as an activity and a process, or translation as a text, right? For example, when you say this is a translation of Bhagavad Gita, then you say that it is a book, right? It's an English book. You don't mean it is activity of translating Bhagavad Gita, right? So this is one inherent problem with the notion of translation, that you're not really clear whether it is an activity, right? Or is it an object, a process, or a product? So what are you studying? Are you studying translation as an activity? क्या पढ़ना चाहते हो? Or translation as an object? Which means, are you going to study the whole activity which involves translation? If you are studying translation of Shakespeare into Hindi, तो ये कैसे हुआ? ये कैसे किया translator ने? That question is the question of translation as translating. But you may not ask that question. You may go ahead and ask, what does this translation do, right? Which means you are asking questions which are product oriented rather than process oriented. And you have heard of distinction between product and a process, right? So translation as a product, you ask a different question. For example, if you're looking at a book like Bible, King James Bible, then you don't ask questions like क्या steps involved थे in translating this book from Hebrew and Aramaic into English. What were those steps taken by the translation? What were the strategies applied? You don't ask that question, because that question belongs to the domain of translating. प्रवृत्ति है, translating की प्रवृत्ति. आप क्या पढ़ रहे हो? Translation की प्रवृत्ति पढ़ रहे हो या product पढ़ रहे हो, चीज पढ़ रहे हो? Translation as a thing, which means then you ask different set of questions. You may ask questions like, how did King James Bible influence subsequent history of English literature? Right? What was the role played by King James Bible in formation of English language, in consolidation of English language? Right? How did political and ideological context of its time influence this book? Or you may also ask questions like, what is the influence of King James Bible on English society and culture? So you, by making this distinction, you are asking different set of questions, right? So once you uncollapse translating and translation, you are able to ask different set of questions to the activity itself. So a researcher has to be very clear about, are you researching translating or are you researching translation? Is this distinction clear? क्योंकि दोनों अलग किस्म के सवाल होते हैं दोनों में. Right? The second distinction that he advocates is between normative and descriptive. And by normative, you mean what is a good translation? What is the proper way to translate? What's the best way of translating? Or is this translation good enough? By normative, you mean you are judging it, right, for its quality. Or you are asking questions about best method of translation. So normative के लिए अलग टर्म होगा evaluative. So are you evaluating translation or are you taking a descriptive position? That means you are just saying ऐसे ऐसे हुआ. You are just describing it. So these are two perspectives, which means, again, going back to the same example of King James Bible, normative set of questions क्या होंगे? Is this a good translation of the Hebrew? Is it accurate? Is it good enough? What is the best way to translate? You are judging it, evaluating it as a translation, right? That is called the normative or evaluative approach to translation. The second is descriptive, where you are not really trying to evaluate or judge. You are just saying this is this and this is this. ऐसे है और वैसे हुआ, ऐसे हुआ है और ऐसे हुआ. You're not saying whether this is better than the original or worse than the original, or this is the best way to translate or this is not the best way to translate. Right? So descriptive approach is something that puts evaluation aside, does not give priority to evaluation and judgment, but tries to describe it. Because you may discover, say for example, King James Bible बहुत ही inaccurate है, मान लो, right? Then you would say that this is a bad translation of Hebrew Bible, and then you would attack that, right? But if you take a descriptive position, you may say that what are the innovations that translator did, and how did these innovations affect the subsequent development of English literature and language, right? So taking a descriptive position very often opens up the space, because judgment and evaluation can be constraining. It can be an obstacle to understanding something, right? Do you agree with my view that evaluation and judgment can become an obstacle in understanding somebody or something?
Yes, sir, because our personal fallacies come in.
Personal prejudice come, and those can limit you as a scholar and researcher. For example, some of the films that you don't like, consider. You have a list of films that you don't like, all of you. For example,
Yes,
example दे दो, कौन सी फिल्म आपको पसंद नहीं है? ये किसी ने सवाल आपको पूछा नहीं ना आज तक. सब लोग ये पूछते हैं आपकी फेवरेट फिल्म कौन सी है. मैं पूछता हूँ आपकी सबसे which is the most hated film or disliked film? बता दो, मैं प्रोड्यूसर को नहीं बताऊंगा आपका नाम. I won't leak it. Yeah.
Sir, it's starring Madhuri Dixit and Alia Bhatt, but I can't recall the name.
Madhuri Dixit.
Yes, that was the worst one, Kalank.
So, Kalank. उसका नाम ही Kalank था. So film
Exactly.
Okay.
Also the remake of Harry Met Sally, that they make it Sejal. Oh my God, that was so worse.
Unbearable था वो.
Yeah, I mean, like, come on, woman, check your purse. Like, I mean, I don't understand the logic. I know that we should not use logic when we see a movie, but how can someone just tells a man that help me find my ring, and then you end up falling in love with that person? I mean, like, who does that?
Logic की बैंड बजा दी बराबर.
Yes, sir.
होना चाहिए ऐसे नहीं कह रहे, पर उसकी वाट भी तो मत लगाओ. Kind of. Okay.
That's
So
Twilight.
Twilight. Okay. As a film or as a novel?
Both.
Both were okay. Now, if you see all the texts that you dislike, you won't ever think of researching them, right?
Sir, yes, I have thought once. Like I don't know. I have never researched. Like, I personally love Harry Potter. I'm very big fan of Harry Potter. So like, I love it so much that I have all.
We are talking about films that we don't like.
We are discussing films that we don't like.
Yeah, but like there is one point about Harry Potter that I want to say that uh, like I have read all the books of Harry Potter, and there are
But you
so many
like that
incredible.
you like that movie and that film, so it does not count.
No, no, listen, let me complete. I'm saying that there are so many, incredible parts in the book itself. But if there would be more in the movie, then I feel that, it would have made the movie much more better. I mean, like,
So because
from on the graphics of,
movie does not include some of the very interesting or impressive sections of the novel, which takes away.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
like that many producers or directed who like the especially those movies who from novel they become a movie.
Now, can you see that many of you are talking about adaptations and remakes, right?
Yes.
Uh, and do you think your prejudice or your dislike comes in your way of understanding the process of adaptation and remake?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, actually उसमें होता क्या है? What is involved in the process of adaptation or in the process of remaking something, right? Or why does the producer or the filmmaker do this to the movie, right? What went behind in his mind while
So
he
you are
did
stuck.
this, right?
So you
So
are stuck.
dislike can actually be a barrier to understanding. Even similarly, even your likes can be barrier to understanding. ये हो सकता है आप किसी बहुत सबसे प्यारी आपकी फिल्म हो can become a barrier for you to understand the film. Is it possible?
Yes, sir.
वो
Yes.
कैसे? ऐसे हो सकता है कि आपकी
So, for example, I'm a big fan of Star Trek, but like JJ verse, so JJ Abrams Star Trek. But the older Trekkies don't like it because they think that the Star Trek is not as similar to the original one. But it can't be because the era is completely different. So he adapted based on the based on this era's sensibilities. So there is a drift between their Star Trek and our Star Trek. So because of that, a lot of times I personally don't like the older version, even though it is considered one of the best Star Treks out there. So our personal liking can also
So what
stop us
what
from
would
liking the
happen? Yeah,
original.
you're absolutely right. If you put aside this best and worst and likes and dislikes aside, and if you see these two versions of Star Trek, and you ask questions like, how does this Star Trek, the earlier version, reflect its times, right? Or what was the technologies available at that time? What can it tell us about history of technology, or what were the cultural aspects of that period in which that film was made? Versus, say for example, how does advancement in technology, filmmaking technology impact filmmaking? And how does contemporary version of Star Trek reflect contemporary cultural issues? If you ask these questions, then do you think it's more fruitful way of comparing these two than saying ये अच्छी है,
Yes, sir.
वो बुरी है, वो पुरानी है, मुझे अच्छी नहीं लगती है, नहीं मुझे अच्छी लगती है, और वो कहेंगे कि वो हमें नहीं अच्छी नहीं लगती, हमको पुरानी अच्छी है. So वहां पे कहानी खत्म हो जाती है. You cannot ask interesting questions about the text or fruitful questions about the text if you are caught up in evaluative works, evaluative judgmental modes, because that becomes a barrier. So even if you dislike the older version of the Star Trek, then you are missing out on how does that text reveal cultural history of that period. right? What was that person's interpretation of this whole narrative of Star Trek, right? How does this fantasy or saga genre develop through ages, right? All these questions cannot be asked if you're caught up in likes and dislikes. So in order to make your study of translation more interesting, you have to keep aside your likes and dislikes and judgments in order to ask more interesting questions about translation. Like again, King James version of Bible, if you say ये तो बहुत घटिया translation है, right? But the fact remains that it's a massive kind of cultural text, right? It influenced English literary style till today. It sets the rhythm of English language. It's one of the key texts of English cultural history. पर वो आप घटिया translation ऐसे आप कहते हो, तो you fail to recognize the cultural significance of translation in your judgmental and evaluative mode, right? And one another example which I keep on giving is a very important text called Unto This Last by John Ruskin was deeply influential in formation of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi's ideology. He was so impressed with the text that he wrote a Gujarati paraphrase of it, and he called it Sarvodaya. And Sarvodaya, idea of Sarvodaya is central to Gandhian philosophy and his political thought and his vision of politics, right? Ruskin is saying, the title of Ruskin's book, I don't know if you've heard of John Ruskin and Unto This Last. Have you heard of it?
Yes, sir.
Where, in what context?
So I don't know. I know that he's an author, but I don't know much about him. But I have heard his name.
Yeah, he's a famous art critic and a very important polemicist, right? And he's attacking the capitalist laissez-faire idea of Adam Smith that was gaining ground in England in 18th century. And he is trying to plead for biblical or Christian socialism, by which he means that God, in his very famous parable of Unto This Last, where there is this whole story of garden and orchard, where God is the owner of that garden, and people have queued up outside, right, to work for his garden. Now, modern capitalist system would say that people who work hard will get most salary, while people who are lazy or people who are poor, who are at the last of that queue, will not get much salary. To which John Ruskin says that Jesus did not do that. He would say that last person would get the same salary as the first person. Jesus does not discriminate between people when giving wages. So why should we do that? Right? So Gandhi adapts this ideal into his own paraphrase called Sarvodaya, and he makes a case that until the last person in India achieves freedom, it is not real freedom. सबका उदय, सर्वोदय. तो जो आखिरी गरीब में गरीब इंसान है, सबसे poor, सबसे weakest person in India does not get freedom. This freedom is illusionary. That was the cornerstone of Gandhian thought, right? So in his political thought was not anti-British, right? Anti-colonial politics was part of his larger agenda to make freedom available to the poorest of poor, as told by John Ruskin, right? So Sarvodaya is a translation of Unto This Last. Now, if you look, compare these two lines. Unto This Last is a phrase that is taken from Bible, right? And Sarvodaya is a coinage of Gandhi. Now, you may say this is a very bad translation of Ruskin. And besides, Ruskin belongs to the colonizers' culture, right? Strangely, he's an Englishman. So what is this anti-colonial fighter using the ideas of the colonizer in fight against colonialism, right? So you can see that paragraph. So what Gandhi is doing is that he's taking this idea and repurposing it for his own goals. So this very important aspect of translation can be lost if you stick to the evaluative methods of translation. By judging this is good, this is bad, you lose out on this important significance and impact of translation on society and society on translation, right? So this kind of repurposing of John Ruskin that Gandhi does in the act of translation, we are not interested whether Sarvodaya is a good translation of Unto This Last or bad. We are interested in what is the cultural politics, what is the agenda of Gandhi behind it, and what is the impact of that text on subsequent freedom struggle. In fact, it became so popular that it was retranslated into English. Gujarati, English किताब गुजराती में translate होती है और फिर बाद में वापस वो English में जाती है. So what do you make of it? Right? Because it's not the same text, right? It has Gandhi's signature all over it. It becomes a Gandhian document of freedom struggle. So even if it is translated into English later on, it still remains a very important polemical, anti-colonial, anti-imperial text. These politics and these significances of translation we will miss out if we take normative stand, if we take evaluative stand, is what he's talking about here. And you can ask whole range of more fruitful questions to translations once we give up this evaluative kind of approach to translation. Okay. The third distinction that he lays out is between analysis and production. This is also very interesting. He says that when you are studying translation, are you doing translation or are you studying translation? That should be very clear. यानी आप खुद translation कर रहे हो क्या या आप translation पढ़ रहे हो उसका अभ्यास कर रहे हो. That should be very clear. Just like when you study literature, you're not studying how to write literature. When you study poetry or a novel, you're not studying how to write poetry or how to write novels. Yes or no?
No, sir, we are analyzing it.
Right. So in similar way, you need not be a translator yourself to study translation. Right. You can study translations in the way that you study poetry or a novel, right? Without learning how to write a novel. So without studying how to translate, you can still study translation. Right. So putting these three things together, what he is doing, he's opening a new domain of research in translation studies. In fact, he's inaugurating a new frame, a new space to study translation. That you need not study translation in conventional sense of judgment and evaluation, of process, or learning how to translate, right? You can study translation as a product. You can study translation in a descriptive way and ask more fruitful questions about its ideology and politics and its impact on society and society's impact on it, right? And you can also study translation in the class very much in the same way as you study a novel or a poem in the class, without learning how to write a poem or without learning how to read, without learning how to write a novel or a play. Right. So once these three distinctions are in place, you can frame your research projects more accurately. So next time when you are studying down to study translation, आपको पहले ये सोचना है, are you studying translation as a process or are you studying translation as a product? आपको ये पहले तय करना, right? दूसरा आपको ये भी तय करना है कि आप ट्रांसलेशन को पढ़ रहे हो या ट्रांसलेशन को कर रहे हो, राइट? अगर आप पढ़ रहे हो तो आप अलग किस्म के सवाल पूछेंगे, रिसर्च क्वेश्चंस, राइट? या आप खुद कर रहे हो तो आप अलग किस्म के सवाल पूछेंगे। फिर आप ट्रांसलेशन का मूल्यांकन कर रहे हो या ट्रांसलेशन को डिस्क्रिप्टिवली स्टडी कर रहे हो, ये आपको तय करना। तो ये तीन बातों में अगर आप तय कर लेते हो, देन यू कैन फ्रेम अ गुड रिसर्च प्रोजेक्ट ऑन ट्रांसलेशन, एंड देन according to Lefevere, you can have a very good interface between a productive kind of give and take between comparative literature and translation. And he uses a very interesting metaphor. The translation which was seen as ugly duckling at one time, right, can turn out to be, can come to the aid of fading swan of comparative literature. So you can see comparative literature is seen as a fading swan, that is as if it's discipline on decline, very much like Basnet has said, or Gayatri Spivak says, right? It's a fading swan, and ugly duckling can come to its help to rescue comparative literature. So one way to revitalize comparative studies is by bringing translation back into its center, which was seen as a kind of marginal or minor activity, takes its central place. Clear? Any questions about this?
No, sir. It's very clear.
No, sir.
Okay, so who will give me back what I said about three distinctions?
Okay, so sir, basically, the first is like those who are studying translation, the basic premise of this is that we need to make three distinctions if we are studying translation. So first is between the act of translation and translating and the object of translation. So is it the
as an object? Translation.
Yeah, as an object.
or
So is it
translation
a
as an
process?
Right.
So is it a process or is it the product? So there are two vastly different things.
यानी
Then
आप क्या
we
पढ़
talk
रहे हो,
about
पहले
the
आपको ये आपको पहले तय करना है, right? What are you planning to
Yeah.
study? Are you studying translating or translation? This is where you are
Yeah.
taking the first call, first stand. Okay. Second one is
the second is normative and descriptive. So here in the normative, when we are looking at translation as a normative process, we are judging it based on a certain biases. And descriptive is just mere describing. So you're not evaluating it and you're not judging it from any lens. So descriptive has a wider scope than normative.
and you can ask
the
more
third-
interesting questions. क्योंकि ट्रांसलेशन हमेशा
Yeah.
कुछ ना कुछ तो उसमें आपको कम मिलेगा ही, राइट? तो वहां पे आपका रिसर्च खत्म हो जाएगा. बट इफ यू स्टार्ट आस्किंग दीज क्वेश्चंस कि जिस सोशल कॉन्टेक्स्ट में वो स्टार ट्रेक बनी थी पुरानी वाली,
Yes.
उसके आइडियोलॉजिकल पॉलिटिक्स की असर क्या होती है या टेक्नोलॉजिकल डेवलपमेंट की असर क्या होती है, राइट? देन यू आर आस्किंग more interesting questions than saying that older is better or newer is better, right?
Yeah, there's a wider scope for research and discovery when we look at the descriptive approach.
Exactly.
And then in context with this, we discussed Ruskin's unto this last and how Gandhi paraphrased it into Gujarati, and then it was again retranslated into English.
Right.
So yeah, so if you look at it from a normative perspective, then our scope becomes limited. But if you look at this same process from a descriptive perspective, then the scope is very wide of the translation and then the retranslation of it. And then lastly, we looked at analysis versus production. So analysis is are we analyzing the act of translation, or are we actually translating? So in that context, we discussed like how we as literature students are we taught to write a novel, or are we taught to analyze it? So that is important when we are looking at translation studies in terms of comparative.
Right. So one time ugly duckling called translation can come to rescue of this fading swan called comparative literature. That's the note on which he ends his essay. So what do you think about this discussion?
So it changed the view on translation. It's not like at least my view. It changed it because I thought that translation, like I didn't know it was so nuanced, and there's so many perspectives on it.
Exactly.
So
there is more to it than you can think of. Right.
Yeah, it's very interesting to see, and the thing is, it's more relevant to us than ever because a lot of the times we rely on it, even without thinking or like thinking that
without knowing it. जैसे Plato or Aristotle आप पढ़ रहे हो, so you're not aware that they are translations, right?
Yeah, sir. So not only like as a literature student, but just as a general consumer of media, like in that terms also, we are relying a lot on translation. Like for example, not everybody is going to be a literature student, and read Plato or Aristotle, but most people are going to watch a movie or watch something on Netflix. So in that sense, we are very reliant on it. So this idea it transcends just literature. That's why it's so important in comparative studies.
Right. And going back to this whole question of Harry Potter and its cinematic adaptation, you have to remember that it is cinematic adaptation, right? It is constrained by time, finances. It's constrained by interpretation that the director brings to the novel, right? So the filmmaker, whoever has made that film on Harry Potter, a novel, he cannot in any possibility depict all the important parts of the novel. So he or she has to select, and that selection will be based on interpretation, right, or understanding of that text. So that filmmaker has to be clear कि 1.5 घंटे में मैं क्या दिखाना चाहता हूँ और क्या point करना चाहता हूँ. What is the point that I'm trying to make? So given that constraints of cinema as a media, you cannot bring in everything from that, right? You can only bring an interpretation of that novel which has a point to make, right? So a filmmaker keeps that in mind while he or she adapts a text. Now that interpretation and your interpretation may differ, and there are financial constraints for the filmmaker, right? जो आपके नॉवेल पढ़ने में नहीं है कोई फाइनेंशियल, अपार्ट फ्रॉम 300, 400, 500 रुपए की नॉवेल पढ़ के आप रख देते हो, फिल्म मेकर के 300, 400 करोड़ रुपए कम से कम लगे होते हैं, right? So that he's working with great amount of systemic constraints. When somebody is taking a text in one media into another, these constraints play a great amount of role, right? And we can ask questions like, say for example, to what extent does our experience of cinema then influences our understanding of later novels? So next time after you saw the first film of Harry Potter, next novels that you read, when you start imagining the text, how much did that film influence you? ऐसे हो सकता है? Did film influence your understanding of the novel later on? The way you
Yes,
imagined
sir.
it, right? So you
Yes,
Yeah,
sir,
sir,
because of the visuals.
so when you start looking at this process of adaptation as an interpretation that happens with certain strict constraints, which are financial, which are commercial, which are technological, you cannot show certain maybe scenes technologically, given the kind of developments in VFX of current times. So you may have to omit it. You cannot capture what is going on in the mind of the character in cinema, right? Because cinema camera is very often positioned as third person. So जो interior monologues है वो दिखाना बहुत मुश्किल हो जाता है. So both are different kind of media, both have different kind of constraints, and they mutually impact each other, right? So all those constraints, or maybe an ideological or political agenda that the filmmaker may have, right? For example, that filmmaker is more interested in pointing out how multiculturalism is under threat. I think there is 1 minute left. Again, I will have to do the same exercise. So let us start a new meeting, the last one, to wind up our discussion for today. Because I think you are ready with presentation, right? Someone?
Yes, sir.
Who? Muskan or?
So I think Muskan, Ashima and I are ready with that.
Okay. So we will restart this meeting and we will have a presentation.
Yes, sir.